Hey, first off, thanks everybody for joining on a Friday afternoon. It's kind of not our normal time. We usually start at 11:30 a.m. Eastern instead of 1:30 p.m. Eastern. But I had a doctor's appointment this morning, and I knew I didn't want to be in that doctor's office mode, worrying about getting out of there and rushing them, which they didn't have to do anyway. I mean, I cleared the doctor's office in plenty of time, but I'm still glad we started a little bit later. So, thanks for that, and thanks again for joining. Real quick, I'm Tim McAlilly, and I'm a cloud solution architect hyphen engineer here at Microsoft, and we're going to be talking about SQL Server 2022, and we're going to use a workshop format that was created by the SQL Server product group, spearheaded in terms of delivery internally, at least, by Buck Woody and Bob Ward and Anna Hoffman. I and some colleagues. I don't know if one of my colleagues is on the call right now, Simon Fastier. He might have gone to the SQL Server 22 workshop or was involved in developing the content. So, and then we'll have other colleagues of mine who are on my Microsoft internal team, who will be joining, potentially be joining to maybe listen in or contribute. What this workshop is, it's a stretched out 10-month version of a full day that was done by Bob Ward and Buck Woody to internal folks back in the fall of 2022. And our mission was to take that content and evangelize that content, process the content and evangelize it, which we're doing now in the community. But we're also doing an internal effort, 4 to 6 hour type workshop internally, but we're using the exact same slides, the exact same labs, um, exact same content. Um, Buckle in, and here we go. So the goals for this workshop, and again, we want to not just talk about SQL Server 2022, right? We don't want to just show you slides. We want you to be able to go and try some features out about SQL Server 2022 and think about why you might want to use SQL Server 22 in your environment, your work environment. And we'll talk and we'll show we'll talk about it, we'll demonstrate and point you to labs you can do on how SQL Server 2022 works around specific features. And then one of the goals, right, is you're getting some hands-on experience around SQL Server 2022 and whatever platform you're using. If you're using Azure or GCP or AWS or some virtual node that's configured on um, VMware or on-prem or a private cloud, it doesn't really matter. We want you to fire up SQL Server 2022 and then be able to walk away from this workshop saying, "Oh, okay, Tim and his colleagues helped me improve my overall SQL Server 22 skill set, and I know more about it than before I went into it." That's a one basic piece, but I want you to be able to understand the features and demonstrate the features on your own, and be in a meeting at work and have some learned authority about the material so that you can evangelize yourself. Again, my name's this is funny. This is my intro slide I use for everything. So if you've been in a I've been doing a lot of Power BI classes recently and SQL Server or Azure SQL classes. So you've seen this. So my name's Tim or Timothy. The reason I go by Timothy, or I put Timothy on my signature block, because, and if your name is Timmy, that's fine. You can be named Timmy. But I myself am not a fan of Timmy. I'm in the wrong, I'm getting ready to get into that side of the 50s. So I'll be 57 in July. And I did not want to be a 57-year-old man called Timmy. So you can call me Timbo, Timmer, Timothy, T Man, whatever. I'm not a fan of Timmy, so to avoid that nickname, I purposely put that on my signature block. And the pain of that is people saying, "Hey, do I call you Tim or Timothy?" That's it. But I say whatever you want to call me, and then I tell them that silly story. Sorry for that. I specialize in SQL Server. And again, if you've been in IT for a while, you started you started your IT career when maybe your favorite software was at a certain version. So I started when I started. Customers were coming off of SQL Server 6.0, still talking about the SQL Server uh, uh, relation to Sybase. The company I was with supported Sybase, Oracle, SQL. Um, so SQL Server 6.0, 6.5, 7.0, then 2000, 2005. The rest is history for that. But that's I started in. I got my start in IT in 1998, but I don't count that. I count October, November 1999. That's kind of when I jumped in to an IT career. I've got over 10 years with Microsoft. I got a nice crystal I put on LinkedIn. They offered me a gift card, but I was like, I'll take the crystal. I heard the people that have been there with Microsoft. I talked to a guy who'd been with Microsoft 20 or 25 years. And they got in, this was before, all the remote stuff and COVID. This was back. He was telling me about it in 2013, but he got invited to Redmond, Washington, and saw, they brought in a comic and they had a weekend. They had a Friday mixer, a Saturday dinner, and a Sunday brunch, and then events throughout. I don't think that. I'll be lucky to make 15 or 20, but 10 years right now, over 10 years, which is good for me. And then I've been with the meetup. I contributed to user groups, and then I joined this meetup. I joined. Well, it used to be Nova SQL user group. We used to meet in the AT&T building in Tyson's Corner, Virginia. But I I was working with Brian Moran, God rest his soul. I was working with Brian Moran, who's no longer with us. Brian Moran and Jim Rotan, who were part of the user group or leading the user group, and they kind of, would ask me to, hey, can you run the user group tonight? So I'd do some things solo. And one night I was doing it solo, and at the AT&T building, we had to keep getting the security guard to take individuals in an elevator downstairs to go where the user group meeting was. It really wasn't convenient for me. So I was like, well, let's do Reston, Virginia, where we know where the paper towels and the sodas and the cups and the bathrooms are. We don't need a security guard. We can allow the late night reception staff to be on duty, of course, but to set the elevators up to allow that access to the third floor. That's why we started meeting in Reston in 2015, and then in 2017, Brian Moran and I started thinking about ways to do events. And we went to PAS, remember PAS, Professional Association of SQL Server? Uh, Trust me, this story is going somewhere. We wanted to do events, and we wanted to do something like a SQL Saturday, but focused on Azure services, Azure data services, and namely around analytics, big data. And they're like, we already have a big data Saturday. You can't call it that. You can call it SQL or Azure SQL Saturday, like a BI SQL Saturday. But we're like, nah, it's not really BI. So we did our own thing. We came up with Azure SQL or Azure Data Fest, and we did Azure Data Fest. And man, there's been an Azure Data Fest in San Francisco. There's been an Azure Data Fest in Seattle. There's been an Azure Data Fest in Boston, Philadelphia, Azure Data Fest, of course, in Reston. And I was also doing some Azure boot camps for a little while. So it's been fun. It's been a fun time. But I have decided to kind of land this ship for myself. So at the end of 2023, I'm no longer going to be running the user group. I've got a person who stepped up to kind of hand it over and take over the reins, and they'll help out with it. And you need fresh content. You need a fresh eyes on this, And I'm just about to wrap up my master's degree and blah blah blah, and I want to go do other things, and I don't. I want to make sure you guys have a good energy and good ideas. So anyway, but you'll see a change of leadership coming in January 2024. Um, uh, that's where that story was going. That's why I wanted to kind of talk about my history of my user group participation. You can catch me on LinkedIn for sure. I live in the DC suburbs, about 25 miles from the U.S. Capitol. I live in Fairfax County in Centerville, Virginia. We're between Fairfax City and Bull Run Battlefield and Prince William County. It's a really pretty area. Um, We're on the edge. We're kind of weird, but I can also get to another county from where I am. I can get to Prince William and Loudon. They're right, 2 miles that way. I've got a wife of 23 years. Um, I started my IT career right before I got married. I was kind of waiting. I was wanting to get my career going before I bothered someone with getting married. But my wife and I have been together for 23, going on 26 years. I've got a 19-year-old daughter who's in college. She goes to Nova right now, Northern Virginia Community College right now, but is pre-admitted, transferring to Mason. Uh, Should probably start in the summer. And then a 9-year-old daughter who's very 9 years old. I don't know what to say. Two cats that we got during the pandemic that we thought would be snuggly cats, but they raised themselves at a foster cat area for the first 4 months of their lives. So they're kind of skittish. They love my daughter, my 19-year-old daughter. They're terrified of my 9-year-old daughter. They're curious about the puppy. So where's my dog? Oh, my wife's in the other living room eating. So my puppy is where the food is. So I have no food near me. So my dog is nowhere to be found. But the cats and the dogs get along great. We don't have like an animal tension house. Sorry about that long introduction. All right. So the meetup times, what we're going to do, and trust me, this is just a kind of a stab at the schedule because this is also on the meetup site, and we'll go to the meetup site and take a look at it. So the meetup times and dates for 2023, again, we're going to follow the same pattern except for May and November. May, as you know, the last Friday of the month is a part of that Memorial Day weekend. And I figured, let's not torture people. Let's go ahead and drop that around, the May 19th area. So February 24th today, talking about the plan. We're in it right now. March 31st, that's when we'll get into the intro to SQL Server 2022. We'll talk about the new features, and then we're things like intelligent query processing as a suite of features has evolved since 2016, 2017, 2019. What's been improved? What are, even to the extent that I can share it, and it'll just be public information that I'll provide a link for if I bring it up. I don't have inside information. They actually sit on that. They sat on the SQL Server 2022, and I say they, the product group, in terms of knowing when it was going to be released. Pretty strong hints that it was, in early October at PAS, which they did wind up doing, but they didn't come to us and say, "Hey, make sure you tell your customers." They didn't give us like a heads up a month out or anything like that. I don't have that kind of information. And then we're going to get into some of the Azure connected features. The SQL Server 22 Azure SQL Managed Instance link. So you can involve a managed instance as part of a failover. We'll also talk about connecting SQL Server 22 to Synapse SQL pools. And we will talk about, what did I forget? Azure single pools. Okay, those are the two. Oh, it will also talk about being able to backup use a backup from managed instance onto SQL Server 22. There's one more. I just escaped me for a second. And then we'll talk about, so that'll be March, April, and May on those two topics. An intro, and then connecting to Azure. We'll talk about how it integrates into Azure. And we'll talk also about the extension, the IaaS agent extension, and also the Azure extension. We'll talk about, for Module 3 in June, we'll talk about accelerating your performance with this built-in query intelligence. We'll talk about, in July, we'll talk about security, scalability, and availability. We'll talk about a sort of a continuation of those topics in August. And then in September, we'll talk about being able to leverage things like third-party storage, as AWS S3 or any other third-party storage providers. And then in October, we'll talk about new T-SQL capabilities. And then November 17th, again, that's the second month. May, notice it's May 19th, and November, notice it's May 17th rather than the last Fridays of each of those 2 months because of sort of a holiday hustle bustle. And then we'll wrap up for 2023 again with that reviewing what we learned, Q&A, um, to kind of pull it all together, if you will. Now the resources, all we're going to use for resources, people will go, "Hey, do you record these?" Yes, we record them, and we'll put them on YouTube under a playlist called SQL Server 2022 Workshop. The playlist isn't recorded because I've got to upload content. I'll upload content after today, after we record this meeting. And if I need to demo something more cleanly and that didn't get demoed well or didn't get demoed at all in one of these sessions, I'll upload a video that'll maybe have a demo in it. But for right now, we're going to have a workshop playlist on our YouTube channel called SQL Server 2022 Workshop. Um, we're going to use content. We'll go there here in just a moment. And we're going to go to this GitHub site. We're going to go to um, the product groups, the SQL Server 22 product groups GitHub that has all the instructions for everything we're going to do. The slide content is there. The lab instructions are there. How to set up your lab. The demo or the wide world importers data sources for different labs are there. Um, so everything we need will be pointed at this GitHub site, this aka.ms/SQL 22 workshop. It's all there for you to use. Now, while we're in the presentation and in the middle of doing these type of sessions, so let's say in March, it'll be slide and demo driven. And I bring that up, not in a bad way or punitive way. Sure, if you're having problems, I'll stop and help you out, or might not stop on the demo piece and help you out, but I'll catch up with you maybe after the session's over to kind of help you out if you're having a significant problem. I've seen some pretty crazy stuff. I will say I had one person that showed up in Reston, and he had uh, I think it was he had some funky version of SQL Server 2016 and he was trying to install it on his laptop, but his laptop was either locked down for work or wasn't even the right version of I'll say Windows 10. It was bad. It was bad. And I just couldn't help him. I was like, "Oh, I can't really help you." So I do raise my hand and say I reserve the right to say, "Ugh, your solution's so whack, I can't help you out." In a nice way, in a nice way. But if it is kind of off kilter, then I probably won't be able to help you. Anywho, it'll mostly be slide and demo driven. Slides, demos, we'll record it. And you can go and review the videos that I show you. You can go review the labs that are on the GitHub site. You can also go and review a lot of video content for SQL Server 22 done by Bob Ward and the SQL Server 22 product group. Right now, bad news, but it's a whole. We're not going to have Azure passes. If you ideally you should do this in Azure, and when we get into our configuring our virtual machine, I recommend you use the Azure Marketplace to pull up a Windows Server 22 pre-configured a Windows Server 22 and SQL Server 22 machine that's pre-configured. You just really have to configure the vCore and the RAM that you'd use. I mean, that's it. Um, uh, we're not gonna have Azure passes available. Um, uh, you know, and again, configuring labs really is not mandatory. You don't, it's optional. You don't, you're not going to be graded for not that, you'd be graded anyway, but not that you'll be evaluated or judged. If you just want to stay along for the ride and watch the demo and watch the slides and take a look at the resources, that's fine as well. If you want to configure this on a laptop, or if you want to configure if you've got an AWS subscription or a GCP subscription or some VM you want to configure, on VMware or Hyper-V or in some private cloud, that's fine. But if you do configure on Azure, or I don't know, I know with AWS I'm taking a cloud security class right now, and I have to shut down my AWS resources. So make sure you shut down your resources if you're on a sort of a public cloud. You want to shut down your AWS and GCP or Azure resources, but certainly between your lab work. And then, all of our meetup sessions will be recorded. We'll post them to YouTube, and there'll be a SQL Server 22 workshop playlist. So real quick, before we go into the resources, uh, recommended, not required, but recommended. There's a SQL Server 22 book by Bob Ward with the forward that's written by, gosh, I don't know what Ronan's title is, or Rohan's title is, but he is, the big chief for SQL Server for Microsoft. I'll just say that, big chief. I just made up a term. But you'll want to at least you want to have a third party resource, right? You want to not just take my word for it or colleagues' word. You want to have look at docs. You want to look at something, and this is SQL Server 22 revealed by Bob Ward. I recommend it. I think it's about $40 on Amazon. I ordered the Kindle version. Oh, no, I haven't ordered it yet, but I will have it by March. I've thought about I remember I have it in my cart. And then we also have at Microsoft, we have this thing called MS Library for internal employees to use. I'm not even going to check out there because that's snapped up. Some lab setup and general information. So let's take a look at some resources super quick. All right. Again, this is the meetup here. I'm sorry, I don't even just show you meetup. I know you're familiar with meetup. That's why you're here. But under the meetup site, I've listed out the events, and we've got the upcoming events for the meetup site, and they all map to our dates. Friday, today, and March 31st, and April 28th, and May 19th, June 30th, July 28th, August 25th, September 29th, October 27th, and November 17th. And each one is the exact same. They all have the same information about each pertaining to each meetup with the schedule, where I repeat the schedule and the general topics, and then a link, where we will work through presentations, demos, and labs from this link. We'll go to this link here in just a second. And then there's our Twitter account. I do tweet that, for example, every time we have a meetup, I tweet. I need to update our cloud events. We do have a website that provides links and photos. I just haven't updated it in a while, but our YouTube site does get updated. So there's the meetup site. If there's changes, the changes will come from the YouTube site. And again, another reason to have these meetings recorded is if you missed a meeting or not able to attend these meetings, you can just go check it out later. Our YouTube site, Azure Cloud Events, we've got some good content that's out there. We've got some playlists for things like we did a joint meeting back in November with the Power BI DC group. We'll probably do one with them again, but early 2024. We've got one. Sorry about that. Let me go to my playlist. For my playlists, we've got some of our Data Fest type events. We've got the Nova SQL meetup, and this will have all oops, sorry, I don't mean to play this. This will have all our content from Nova SQL meetings. But we'll have a new playlist for the workshop for all of them. So it'll be a playlist for all the workshops, other workshop sessions that we're going to do for 2023. So go out there, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and follow along the playlist. And after each session, like after today is over, I'll go out to the meetup site and I'll go onto the general page here, and I will, oops, excuse me, I will post in the discussions, which I do use a lot. I'll post in the discussions, hey, the video is ready for you to take a look at. And this is the post I did earlier in the month where I said it's time for me to turn over the reins. And I found somebody to kind of take over. who you'll love, who is part of the data platform environment, who has some great ideas and will work well. I have another friend and colleague, Prashant Boyer, but he runs another AI ML set of user groups, but he'll work well with Prashant as well. All right. So there's the note, there's the meetup with all the dates in it. There's the YouTube channel where everything's going to be recorded and posted. So let's go out to the GitHub site. And the site I'm referring to is, here, I'll go into the YouTube, I mean the meetup site and follow a link for the presentations. It's this right here. And it'll link you out to here. And there's a link here called Microsoft SQL Workshops, SQL 22 workshops. And this has all the materials in it. It has the slides in it. The top page here, right, without any additional hyphens. The github.com that is a forward slash Microsoft, and then SQL workshop hyphen SQL 22 workshop. This is a great landing page. There is a folder here at the top of GitHub that has the slides in it and all that. If there's updates to the slides, I'll update the deck we're using, because I'm trying to accomplish a couple things. I'm trying to do these workshops for the community, but also save a swim stroke and also do this internally as well with some colleagues. The internal effort for the colleagues, 4 to 6 hours, probably on a Thursday afternoon for internal employees, and then what we're doing over several months. But you can see what the workshop's about. Again, it's trying to focus the problems that SQL Server 22 can address, the learning objections, the business applications of the workshop, hybrid scenarios, performance, consistency, data integrity, high availability, T-SQL improvements. There's some different technologies that are used here in the workshop. SQL Server 22, of course, and then in part of that, intelligent query processing that's available in Azure SQL databases and Azure SQL Managed Instance, as well as SQL Server 22. We're also using, all my demos are going to be based on the Microsoft Cloud Platform, Microsoft Azure. So you'll see the virtual machine configured there, and you'll see some objects stored there. You'll see an Azure SQL Managed Instance configured there. You'll see a Synapse SQL pool connection. You'll see Query Store, which is enabled by default for SQL Server 22. Ledger for SQL Server, which is really nice blockchain technology to prevent people from messing with your data. Polybase, improvements to Polybase. You'll see SQL Server Management Studio used, and you'll see Azure Data Studio used. On the virtual machine right now, I've got configured SQL Server 22, Azure Data Studio, and SQL Server Management Studio and Azure Data Studio. Sorry about that. Some things you're going to want to do for the workshop. You're going to want to make sure that, and again, if you're familiar with these terms, that's great. If you know what cloning and forking and all that means, perfect. And you know how to work in a DevOps environment, that's great. Do that. Clone the workshop and make a repo for or a repository for yourself that's got all these artifacts. Or you can just hit on, a little download link that's going to download a main.zip file. You're going to want to just go and click on this, and you'll go in your downloads, and there it goes. And you'll have all the content, the scripts. I'll show you this on the virtual machine momentarily. Yeah, just a second. So I wanted to make sure the virtual machine was awake, because that's always frustrating. So you can just click on this and just download the zip file and unzip the zip file in a directory where you're going to want to know where it is. Ideally you'd want to do it, on your laptop for content, and maybe even on the VM, because it does have scripts in it and things like that that are most easily handled locally. and then have a virtual machine and install SQL Server 22 and Azure Data Studio and SQL Server Management Studio. If you do Management Studio 19.1, I believe you'll get Azure Data Studio together with it. Um, that's what was the case with my virtual machine. So there's some options there. You can install them individually, or there's I believe SQL Server 19. SQL Server Management Studio 19.1 has Azure Data Studio and Management Studio in it. And then there are some minimum recommendations here around setup. And I'm pointing this out to you so you don't pass it over, so you don't just not, glance at it and don't pay attention to it, because it could mean some things later. We're not going to be doing any, 8 million row report processing, but you're going to want to take a look at, you know, the compute level for what we're asking you to set up. Windows 10, Windows 11, Windows Server 2019, or Windows 22 with at least 4 CPUs and 8 gigs of RAM, right? That's most desktops have 8 to 16, but you'll probably want to put it on a virtual node on with a server size host. Um, um, we do have an exercise that would require 8 CPUs and exercise 3.2 and 24 gigs of RAM, but you could also have that as an optional exercise. I'll take a look at that exercise and make sure that it's well demoed, so in case you don't have those resources handy. I think my new Microsoft laptop that I got the other day in the mail is 32 gigs of RAM. I don't know about the core. I think anyway. If you're going to use Linux or container users, you'll be able to get through a lot of these with SQL Server on Linux or running it in a container. Some of the exercises are going to require, this is one of the things you'll download, OStress, which is a command line tool which will stress out the IO that's hosted on that hosts your SQL Server to get that workload simulation going. So OStress is a Windows only program. And now you can, I mean, as a Linux person or a SQL Linux container person, you might know of some good IO monitoring tools. I myself can't even professionally comment on them, but you could figure that out, and you could grab some IO tools for Linux or SQL Server on Linux or SQL Linux in a container and get some data back around how that workload performs. Um, if you have, you'll need an Azure subscription for Module 2, right? Because we're going to do some things in terms of connecting to Azure. We'll use the Azure, excuse me, with the SQL Server 22 to Azure SQL Managed Instance and to Synapse connectivity that you'll want to have an Azure subscription for, because those are Azure services and we're showing you can connect to these, right? You can't configure an Azure SQL virtual machine, or excuse me, an Azure SQL Managed Instance or Azure SQL Synapse workspace in SQL Pool in anything but Azure, unfortunately. You can use, in terms of editions of SQL Server 22, you can use an evaluation edition or a developer edition, and you can pull those down. There's a link right here, Get SQL Server with the database feature engine installed, and you install it from the download link and you're off and running. Exercise in Module 5 will require the Polybase query service for external data features. So you might have to rerun the setup and enable the Polybase service. I'm going to see what mine has, and I've got a gallery image that I installed configured in about 10 minutes. Walked my dog, and I came back, and it was done on a 40-minute dog walk. Where is my dog? Oh, there's my dog. Hey, Lily. She is out. I woke her up this morning at 4:45 because I went to my doctor's appointment, at 7. I left my house at 6. So I was like, ugh, what do I do with the dog? Should I pretend like I don't see her and just go out the back and leave her in her crate? Or do I wake up and bring her out and feed her and let her go out and potty? And that's what I did. So she is pooped. Anywho, again, there's the polybase piece. Also, configure SQL Server mixed mode authentication. There is a feature that we will talk about on the when we get into integrating Azure Active Directory accounts for SQL Server 22. But the image that I've got configured is in a um, a tenant that was configured for internal employees, but I don't believe there's an Azure Active Directory service that I can leverage. So it's not, well, it's kind of a complicated story, but we're not gonna be able to do that with the image that I created. We'll be able to do screenshots and all that stuff. Again, if you can set up a named instance if you need to, but you might, some of the scripts might be looking at local, at the actual installed instance or the default instance, but you can use named instances for sure. If you're going to install Management Studio, grab the latest 18, 18.x or .x copy, or 19 from AKA .ms, SMS, SSMS 18 or SSMS 19. That's right there. Super quick download. Install the Azure Data Studio. Um, and then there are some links here for data, and it's super easy. Uh, I'm sure you guys all remember Codeplex or different sites that had demo data, but you had to click on those and download. But check this out. I'm just going to click on this, and it's going to click off a download. So it's going to, and not even anything after unzip, it's going to a back file. So different, there's a wide world importers data warehouse database for module 3. Then for module 3.1, there is a parameter sniffing option for, and that database is there. And then there is a degree of parallelism database. And you just and they'll all three work for all three labs, but specific for module for the exercise 3 and module 3, you want to have the underscore MGF database. Specific for 3.1 and module 3, you want to have the underscore PSP option database or op database. And specific for exercise 3.2, module 3, worldwide importers underscore DOP. Just click on it, download it, and download it from the disk full. Anyway, you'll want to get those downloaded and you'll be off and running. And then you can restore those .back files onto your SQL Server with no problem at all. And then you can download the OS tool. Actually, the OS stress tool will download the RML setup.msi file. You just download from OS stress and you'll be off and running and able to use the OS stress from the command line when you need to. And then all the scripts for OS stress are in the lab instructions. Again, this kind of goes along with the slides that the earlier slide. Here's how the workshop modules: intro to SQL Server. Then we're going to spend 2 months on the Azure connection, or the connect SQL Server to Azure. How we'll talk about SQL Server being a hybrid platform, accelerated performance, power your database with security, scalability, availability, data virtualization, object storage, and new SQL or T-SQL features. And then there's here in the GitHub piece, they'll talk about some general who contributed and all that. Now, if you're kind of scooching around and you want to take a look at the lab itself, click on that workshop folder right there, and you can open that up. And then you can see the lab subfolders are built: Azure Connected, Query Intelligence Engine, Data Virtualization, T-SQL. And then you can see there's an MD or an Azure notebook there that's and we'll take a look, or a sort of a Jupyter notebook that is there, that's .mds. And then there's some slides. If you go in the slides, you can see the SQL Server workshop, SQL Server 22 workshop, PPTX. That's the deck we are using, folks. And if there's an update to it, we'll roll forward with the updates. When you ask me about, hey, Tim, do you have slides for this? Your slides are right here. They're always going to be here, and this is where we'll go. And that's why I tried to. There's some slides I added for today around setting up your Azure VM, but it's that aren't part of this deck, but they'll be part of the video. So there's the slides, and then there are the subdirectories for the labs, and there's exercises that you can go and you can see that they, 2.0, 2.4, or 2.0 to 2.4, where are these exercises? There's the little subdirectories: Synapse Link, Azure Arc, Azure Active Directory Authentication, Purview. That's the other one I was trying to think about. Azure connection to SQL MI from SQL Server 22, SQL Synapse, and Purview. But you can see there's the Azure Active Directory, and then there's scripts. And then there is a README that gives you the idea about what the instructions are, which I will go back over after for each session. I will go through all these instructions, all these scripts per session, and you can go take a look at what the SQL looks like if you wanted. Then we can take a look at built-in query intelligence. You can see degree of parallelism feedback and persistent or memory grant feedback and parameter sniffing. And then you go in the README file and you can see what the general instructions are. And then you can go and open up and see the different scripts. And you can see that there's a README file built on the bottom of this. So you can go in and just click on the subdirectory itself. It'll open up with the scripts, and then at the bottom a read, and keep two browsers open so you can look at the instructions and also execute the scripts. This is why I was saying, and I'll show you this in just a second. Download that GitHub. Either fork the link if you're familiar with that, or just download that zip file, that main.zip file, and open up these scripts locally so you can run these scripts. They'll be readily available for you. And you can kind of step through the steps for the lab. So there's the workshop itself in GitHub. Now let me show you just a couple of things here. When I mentioned before, that I'm using the Azure Gallery Lab. Let me or the Marketplace Lab. Let me kind of show you. Oh, just you'll get these slides are out there. These slides are part of the main deck that you can download. The table of contents, but also a link to the workshop, a link to the video series, a link to demos that you can look. And these are demos done by Bob Ward and Pedro Gonzalez and the SQL Server 22 product team. So now setting up your SQL Server 22 environment, I'm going to step you through some screenshots real quick, and then I'm going to go and look at the Azure virtual machine that I've configured, and then step you through kind of like how to get to the marketplace. And again, these instructions are specific to Azure. Setting up your virtual machine on Azure, that is. But you can use for setting up SQL Server 22, you can set it up wherever you need to, but you need to have an Azure subscription. So I need to put that in there for the slide. I used the Azure Marketplace example. And then you configure and deploy the VM, and then connect to the VM, and then configure databases on SQL Server. Again, in Azure, there is an Azure Marketplace. So you would go into, and again, I'll step you through how to get there, but you type in Marketplace. And when you click on Marketplace, what in the Marketplace, where you set your, use SQL Server 22 as a search term. And it'll show you the images that are pre-configured in the marketplace. And this is a pre-configured image in Azure for SQL Server 22 that's running on Windows Server 22. And when I say pre-configured, it already has log drive storage attached. It already has data file storage attached. It's already got the tempdb set. So then you can, there's some choices you make, right? Because you want to pick the type of virtual machine to leverage for your workload. For myself, I wanted to have something that wasn't so much dev test. I wanted to have production. I wanted boot diagnostics. I wanted high availability and Azure backup, just so I wouldn't limit myself. So I chose the production type workload. But that's okay. I'm going to turn it off when we're done with our workshop today. I selected for the workshop for myself a general purpose because it gave me the sizes that I needed. Right, I wanted to have a range of CPUs with the optimal CPU to memory config with a nice workload type around, you know, supporting a relational database service, right? And that's talking about the OS. But you can also choose memory optimized or compute optimized if you're going to do any of the, you know, compute intensive workloads or memory intensive workloads. And again, I'm just passing through this screen. I created a resource group. I created the virtual server name. Where do I want it running in US East? I chose not to do any availability for the Windows Server. No type of clustering or always on availability. Um, the security is standard, and I chose a free license, SQL Server 22 on a developer edition on Windows Server 22. So I'm not charged a licensed. I chose the 64-bit architecture. Excuse me, go back. For the size, you can look at all the different sizes, but I chose something with 4 CPUs and 16 gigs of memory. And I looked at the price, right? I don't want to uh, just because it's running or I forgot to run it or I forgot to shut it down. I don't want to have this absorb, all the subscription money that we have. I went in, I chose the administrator account is the administrator for the server, right? When you log into your Azure virtual machine, and this is again, I don't know if this is specific to AWS or GCP or VMware, your private cloud technologies, but you configure your username and your password, and that's what you use to log into your local machine. So that's what I'm using to log into my virtual machine. I allowed terminal services or remote desktop 3389 initially, right? This is some initial configuration choices, licensing. If you're in a company and you've got an Azure subscription and you've got a SQL Server Enterprise Edition with software assurance, or you've leveraged the Azure Hybrid benefit, leverage this. Check that box. You have a company that already has a existing Windows Server, existing SQL Server license. You can translate what you've already paid for your on-prem, your SQL Server and Windows Server costs into discounts for Azure. Then for your disks, they're already configured, but I just accepted the defaults here: premium, local SSD, and then the key is managed by the Azure services. And then I left off the encryption at host for this. I again just accepting the defaults here, but for your disks, for your marketplace image, your log and your data are already drives already configured. For networking, I accepted the defaults, and it took my server name and added -vnet and created a subnet and a public IP that you'll access, right, with your remote desktop protocol. I selected the defaults for the NIC security group and my inbound ports. And again, RDP 3389. And then I didn't select anything around deleting the public IP. I have accelerated networking. That was a default that I selected. I then placed this virtual machine behind an existing load balancing solution. I didn't have that selected at all. Everything's pretty much the defaults. And then for the management section, I didn't select anything. But if you wanted to, you could set up a patch window if you've got some kind of management or orchestration and you want to have time reserved for when you're going to do patches. You can set that up, or you can also set up identity. You can also set up login with Azure ID. Azure AD. My subscription doesn't support that. That's okay. We'll absolutely talk about it. And then you can also set up auto shutdown. So maybe maybe this is a dev box and you go home on Fridays at 5 p.m. Eastern. You want to set the machines to automatically shut down. And you can also set up disaster recovery with Azure Site Recovery. And then for monitoring, um, you might want to have some additional monitoring on top of that. Enable some recommended alert rules. I might go back and set that up. I accepted all the defaults. And then some advanced tabs, kind of a very tiny font slide here, but it installs some Azure extensions. There is an IaaS agent extension that you can install, which will do basically give some PaaS features to your virtual machine, like automated backups, automated patching, storage, tempdb configuration, integrated with Azure Key Vault, um, licensing options that you can kind of dig into, an integration with Microsoft Defender. You can jump through all these different pieces by having the right agent on here. But other than that, I selected the defaults. And then the SQL Server settings. Again, this is for to log into your SQL Server box. I use the same name as my local machine for the virtual machine that I created. But you don't have to. You could, SQL 1 and a password for that. And then I disabled Azure Key Vault integration, but you can enable it later. You can see the storage that's configured, but you can change that. There is a SQL data drive, a SQL log drive, a SQL temp DB drive that you can change the configuration to. There are some SQL Server instance settings that you can configure around max stop and memory limit and collation. That's default collation for your server. And then kind of underneath that is a long screenshot. There's some licensing options. Or again, you can bring in AHub. Sorry, I don't mean to do shorthand jargon. We call AHub the Azure Hybrid Use Benefit. Get it? Hybrid Use Benefit, AHub. There's also patching you can set up, automated patching, automated backup. You can even set up R services. These are the things that you can actually set up with your Azure agent or IaaS agent extension once you get it running, or if you enable it after the virtual machine's configured. And then once you get it installed and run, you're going to want to tell you that the resource is ready. You can go check on it. You want to. And again, this interface here is, the connecting interface. You want to connect to your virtual machine, and you want to do it over RDP. There is an RDP port that's open, but I like to go ahead and do one more rule. You're going to add another inbound port rule. Make that a priority higher than your RDP rule, and do port 8080, which it'll select that default. Any for your protocol source and destination, and set that to allow. And then you can go in and select RDP on your virtual machine. And then from there you can, sorry. You can download the RD. Yeah, sorry about that. You can download the RDP file. And again, it'll just by clicking on download, after you select RDP and hit the download button there, the little RDP download button will pop up. And if you've got the network pieces connected, then you connect onto your virtual machine. The virtual machine is connected here. Here's my SQL Server virtual machine that I've got configured. I've got SQL Server 22 installed. I've got my wide world importers data warehouse, and I've got my PSP and my Max or PSP and my DOP for the different labs, and we'll talk about those in a second. And you can take a look at the storage here. You notice you've got a SQL data and SQL log drive and temporary storage here on D drive. And I created a subdirectory where I've downloaded from Git. I downloaded I just hit this, downloaded the main.zip git file. I extracted that main.zip here all local, SQL workshops, or SQL workshops hyphen SQL Server 22 workshop hyphen main. There it is. There's the workshop. There's all the labs for the workshop. There's the slides that and as again, if you download this or I recommend you check it for updates. I'll let you know if there's an update, but don't rely on me. If there's an update to this deck or these labs, download it, check it out. But you can go and see. Oh, sorry about that. I probably should have done a little bit. Here we go. But you can see the Azure Connected Labs and Purview and Synapse Link, and you can. Oh yeah, should open that. But you can go and take a look at the different scripts and all that kind of good stuff, and you're off and running. So there's the VM. And then to get the VM going, again, we're wrapping up here in just a minute. Also on this VM, there's Azure Data Studio, which is basically the same thing, but Azure Studio has, you can open up those notebooks and you can, there's some additional extensions here for the different work you might want to do. And you can take a look at, there's an admin pack and one for Azure Arc and Azure CLI. We'll talk about these for just in general context. And then for the VMs themselves, this is sort of the Azure view of the virtual machine. This is me and my Azure subscription. And this is where my virtual machine is. And if I click on my virtual machine, I can see it. And I can go and stop it. And I can go and configure, additional storage if I wanted. Or I can take a look at whatever I need to. I believe the SQL IaaS extension is installed, so you can go and uh, configure different elements of the IaaS extension. And if you've got the IaaS extension, you get the virtual machine view of management, which we'll talk about, and then you get the SQL Server view of an Azure SQL Server and get SQL Server specific choices. So see if you went to SQL Server configuration and then manage this virtual machine as a SQL Server, you can see these additional choices: licensing, Azure Key Vault, R services if you wanted to do machine learning, storage configuration, automated patching, backups, and SQL connectivity. There is a public, plenty of public resources to look up to talk about the IaaS SQL agent extension that you can go through and talk about the different choices. We'll talk about these in our workshop a little bit. Now let's say I mentioned workshop. I mentioned not mentioned workshop, but I mentioned the gallery and the marketplace. If I went here and I just typed in marketplace, I typed in mark, and I brought up marketplace. You'll get this whole marketplace. The marketplace is where we have pre-configured images, pre-configured services that you can fire up. If I went in and had SQL Server, 2022, you can get the range of choices. This is what I recommend that you do, right? Not analysis services, not SQL Server 2019, um, um, just SQL Server 2022 on Windows Server 22. And then I'll just have another tab here. Oh, sorry, not out. And you just kind of step through it and then create it. And it gives you additional choices. Free SQL Server license, SQL Server 22 Developer Edition on Windows Server 2022. Then the Web Edition, then Enterprise Edition, then Standard Edition. You need to have licenses for the Web and Enterprise and Standard. But if you kick off install this on I won't install it for you guys, but you can see the different images that are out there. I mean, you can see the different sizes that are available. recommended images by publisher. You can see all the sizes. There's general purposes, compute intensive, memory intensive. And you kind of step through and create your virtual machine. And then again, configure what, log into your virtual machine and configure SQL Server 22 and restore your databases with nothing more than a click, right? Download the zip file to get all the materials, all the labs, and all the slides. And then download the databases from here. Download all the tools. It's so crystal clear. The instruction says. All right, guys, it's been an hour. We're going to go ahead and stop it right here. But I hope you come along for this ride. I hope you follow along either with either the recordings or join us live on those last Friday of each month, except for May and except for November, and join us. All right. Do we have any questions about anything we talked about? Thanks, Simon, by the way.
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
So SQL Server is a program. It's not like an operating system, right?
Nope. It's a relational database management system.
So we can just download it on our computer, right?
On a Windows 10, Windows 11.
Windows 10.
There's also, it does support Linux as well.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, SQL Server 22. And you might want to, it sounds like you might want to read up on some of the history, but it kind of came out with SQL Server 4.3 and I think the mid 90s, and then SQL Server 6.0 and 6.5 in the late 90s, and SQL Server 2000, and then 2005, 2008, 2008 R2, SQL Server 2012. Was there 2012 R2? Anyway, SQL Server 2014, SQL Server 2016, SQL Server 2017, SQL Server 2019. And we're talking about SQL Server 22. Yeah.
And then if we use Azure, how much would it cost just to have the Windows server running it?
Well, the thing about Azure that'll show you, the virtual machine that I configured, if I left it running for the full month, it looks like it'll charge me less than $400 a month.
Okay.
But like I mentioned before in my slides, stop that virtual machine, do your lab, do your learning, and stop the virtual machine every time you use it, and you won't really spend any money. I'm talking, I bet you 30 to 50 bucks maybe a month.
Right.
If you use a cloud platform. And then with managed instances, there's the lab for managed instances. There's a lab for Synapse. You can stop a managed instance now. Stop that managed instance when you configure it, and stop that or pause that SQL pool when you get into Azure Synapse. Any other questions, guys? All right. Well, everybody have a good weekend, and I'll see you guys in March. If you have any questions about this, just email me. You can see my email from the meetup. And we can, I'll work with you. I'll see if it's something I can handle easily, we can get past it. All righty, everybody. Have a good weekend. I will post this recording as soon as it comes. YouTube takes about maybe an hour, or not YouTube, but Teams takes about an hour to process the video, depending on how long the meetings are. For an hour-long meeting, probably about an hour long to process it. So I'll have it up by 4 o'clock this afternoon, 4 or 5, and I'll let you guys know in the discussions on the main part of Meetup.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Sure. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Steve. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Oh, hey, Tim.
Yeah.
Are you going to SQL Saturday in Jacksonville is in May 5th and 6th. And Bob Ward is doing the workshop, 2022 workshop for pre-con on Friday here in Jacksonville.